There we go. So you should be able to see my screen. Thank you very much for your time. My name is Dave Davis. I'm CEO of a company called Calliope Networks. We are a company that aggregates content to license to AI companies for model training. My background is I worked at movie studios for about 20 years. I worked at Universal, at Paramount, and at 20th Century Fox. And then most recently was chief commercial officer of a private equity owned licensing company called the Motion Picture Licensing Corporation. And I'm based in Los Angeles. Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I'm thrilled to be doing this, and especially doing it with you. And I think very highly of a Calliope network. So I'm thrilled to be participating. So for those of you who don't know, the Copyright Alliance is we represent the interests of about 15,000 different organizations across the spectrum of copyright. So when you think of copyright, you usually think of movies and music and and book publishing and video game publishers. But we also represent a whole bunch of folks that maybe you don't think about when you think about copyright, things like sports leagues and let's say the National Association of Realtors that has their MLS database, or the National Fire Protection Association. So copyright has this very broad reach. We also represent about 2 million individual creators, the photographers and the performers and songwriters and software coders and authors and artists and many others who, like podcasters, who make their living through creativity. And our mission at the Copyright Alliance is to promote and preserve copyright, the value of copyright, and to protect creators like those of you podcasters online and copyright owners. And we do that through working with policymakers, working in the administration, working with the Copyright Office, filing briefs in federal court, and of course educating the public as well. So if you go to our website, you'll find a lot of information there. And obviously, one of our biggest issues is AI and copyright. So I'm thrilled to be doing this with Dave here, and happy to try to do what I can to educate the masses on AI and copyright. So Dave, I'm going to throw it back to you.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Keith. So what we're going to do today, we're going to give a brief technological overview on AI. Then I'm going to turn it to Keith to talk about some of the legal stuff. I'm looking forward to that update myself because there's so much going on and it changes every week. And then I'll finish up with a commercial overview of what is really happening in the market. So we're without my co-founder Jim Golden, who is a longtime AI ML engineer, former partner at PwC and Accenture. So I've borrowed a few of his technology slides. He's much better at presenting those than me, but I'll do my best. But he's got a few really golden nuggets in there that I think will be helpful. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about technology. First thing is, again, Jim would emphasize AI is not one technology, but it's a broad field. He's got a couple of good quotes here. I like the one in the lower right, that AI is the attempt to make computers do what they do in the movies, which I think is clever. He also highly recommends this book by Elaine Rich, Kevin Knight, and Shivashankar Nair. So for what it's worth, if people are looking for reading material to really get to what it is, that's a good place to start. So today you've got a variety of actors in the AI space talking about artificial generalized intelligence and big concepts like that, really machines that will be smarter than humans. And they're talking about those things happening in the next year or two. I will again say that my co-founder Jim is a skeptic on those fronts, and he points out on this slide that people have been saying things like that for a long time. That versions of artificial general intelligence are right around the corner. So going all the way back to 1956 and 1966, and I'll explain a little bit why he's a skeptic on that as well. So some common AI models and terms. Just to level set, there's most of you will know this. There's LLMs, which are large language models. These are basically text-based models. They're chatbots. And what these are, they are language prediction machines. So if you type in 20 words, the chatbot will try to predict what the 21st word is. And as they get more and more sophisticated, they can do this on a much more grand scale and with a great deal of sophistication. Now, again, my co-founder Jim, his view on this is really that when you boil it down, what OpenAI and others are doing is they're creating these massive tables of word prediction, of language prediction, And he doesn't really see how no matter how complicated those get, and no matter how many words are in those tables, he doesn't really see how that model translates to artificial generalized intelligence. So it's amazing, but he doesn't think that technology is the one that's going to like replace human beings and become the Terminator and take over the world. So that is what it is. You'll hear from certainly other scientists who will disagree. Diffusion models are the ones that are most common in video. They're strange things, and I'll show a sort of an image of how they work. But what they do is they start with noise. So that, if you remember your old TVs, when you had a rooftop antenna and you had just noise on the screen when you turned to a channel that didn't have anything. That's what these things start with, and they come to an image or to a video by removing the right noise and leaving the stuff that they want to leave. I'll show an image of what that means. And then there's something that's called retrieval augmented generation. This really sits on side of the models. This is when you see that OpenAI is doing different deals with news companies, with Financial Times and with The Atlantic and so on. They're doing this. So this augments the model, which might have been fully built a year ago. It can augment the model with news that came out yesterday. So just from a different source, it's not all the way baked into the model. There's another term that I probably should have put in here that now people are using. It's multimodal models, and that is really models that can work in all different modes of content, from text to photos to video to audio, etc. And really, at its base, what we're talking about is AI provides computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. I won't go deeply through this slide. So what is the data for? The data is teaching these models about the world. So for LLMs, first they needed a baseline just to teach patterns and enable predictions. So they just needed to learn how to speak English, how to speak French, how to speak whatever language. Now that they've sort of conquered that, now they are when AI companies are looking for data, for text data, they're tending to look for things that are pretty specific, pretty fact-based, and most sought after is STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, and other nonfiction. The days of being able to license masses of fiction works, is probably past. And then diffusion models, again, to create images and video, and the Calliope networks, we mostly work in video. These diffusion models need examples of almost an infinite variety of things in the world. So for example, so the most common diffusion models are in our video models from OpenAI, like Sora. There's a company called Runway. NVIDIA has built one of these. Adobe has built one. Meta, Google, etc. And these video models, they're called text to video. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them are text to video. And into a text prompt window, you can type anything. So you can type that you want a video of a cowboy riding a camel through the streets of Tokyo. And then a few seconds later, you've generated a 10-second video that shows that. And in order for that model to do that, it had to be previously exposed to different videos and images of cowboys and of camels and of the streets of Tokyo. And if you change your mind and actually you don't want a camel anymore, but you want a unicorn, and you don't want Tokyo anymore, but you want New York, it needs to know what those things look like as well. So that's a long way of saying these models need to understand everything, basically. So it requires a massive amount of data. Okay, diffusion models at work. I talked to one researcher in this space, and he said, and I quote, "The fact that this works at all is a fucking miracle." So I'm not going to pretend that I really understand how or why this works, but I'm going to kind of show you what happens, and I'm not going to tell you why it happens because I don't know. But basically, the researchers will start with an image. So they'll start with the picture in the upper left of a sailboat on the water, and then they will diffuse it. They'll add noise to it until they get to a purely noisy image. Then what they'll do is they'll tell the brains to create an image of a sailboat on the water, and they'll diffuse that a million times. And 999,999 of them will be nonsense, but one of them will come out to something that's pretty close to a sailboat on the water. And the researchers will then say, okay, computer, you did a pretty good job on that one. And the computer will learn, okay, that's how I derived that one. So that's how it works. It's mind-boggling to me, but it's mind-boggling to people in this world. So where does AI get all of this data? They get a lot of it from, and this is where we'll sort of start the transition to Keith. They get a lot of data from copyrighted content, including your podcasts that they've famously scraped on YouTube and other places. There's famous court cases right now around things like something called the Books 3 data set, which is a data set that was originally created by researchers and then borrowed by AI companies with about 200,000 books in it. And I've got a few headlines at the bottom, showing news of Meta, Runway, and NVIDIA, scraping massive amounts of data. They will argue that that's okay. I'll leave it to Keith why they argue that that's okay, but they will. And with that, I'm going to stop my share and I'll turn it over to Keith.
All right, thanks, Dave. Let me share my screen now. All right, and do the slideshow. All right, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen at this point. Thank you very much. Let me just clock in the time here. All right, so I'm gonna give a little bit of a background first before I jump into the kind of nuts and bolts of copyright and AI, and I'm gonna kind of start at a very basic level and not get into try not to get into the weeds too much, but we can certainly talk about any specific questions folks have at the end when we do our Q&A. So let me just start off with here. With the copyright lines, what are our members thinking, right? I mean, our members support respectful, responsible, and ethical development and use of AI technologies. Matter of fact, many of them have been using, like look at the movie studios, video game companies, they have been using AI for many, many years. Some of our individual creators are just starting to toy around with it and go, okay, how can I use this to make my business better, my product better, or something like that. And we'll talk a little bit about that for those of you who might be interested in kind of exploring AI and using AI, what that means in terms of your copyrighted works. We'll talk about a little bit about that at the end. But it's important to understand at the outset that each copyright industry is impacted differently. And so I'm going to talk at a very high level, but AI does impact each copyright industry differently. For instance, movies is different than music and is different than text. And why is that? Well, that's because they have different business models. There are different provisions in the copyright law that apply to them differently. But most importantly, and Dave started talking about this is why it's a good transition here, the AI models impact them differently. The large language models arguably have to copy a lot of text to order to figure out. I think Dave's example was you've got 20 words, what's the 21st word, right? In order to do that, a lot of text generally has to be copied. And if you're talking about music, you don't need to. Matter of fact, there's some music models out there that don't copy any copyrighted works because there are a limited number of chords, of notes, of progressions, and so they don't really need to copy anything. I think Boomi is on one hand good example, but maybe not a good example for other reasons that we can get into if need be. So the result is that we hear, you might hear different views from different copyright owners or copyright industries, but I think intra-industry, within the movie industry, within the music industry, within the text industry, you're going to hear this pretty much the same thing. And I'd be very interested to hear, where the podcasters are here. And so, like I said, we can talk about that at the Q&A section if folks are interested. All right, so with that background, let me talk about copyright law and talk about what copyright law is. Copyright owners are granted several exclusive rights. I put them up on the screen here. They have the right to reproduce, or i.e. copy the work, to prevent others from doing that, to distribute the work, to display the work publicly, perform the work publicly, and prepare derivative works. In other words, sort of modify the work into something else. And that really comes into play when you're talking about AI. Now, when someone engages in one or more of these rights, so let's say somebody makes a copy of a work, that person, that organization is going to be an infringer, right? Unless one of three things is true. So if somebody distributes a work without authority, reproduces a work, prepares a work, derivative work, whatever, they are going to be an infringer under the copyright law, unless either there is a defense in the law, something like fair use, which we are going to talk about a lot in a minute, that excuses the infringement. The work is not protected by copyright. Maybe it's in the public domain or something, or just isn't protected by copyright. And then also, most importantly, the user has a license to use the work from the copyright owner. Those are the three ways, and the only three ways that somebody can be excused. And if one of those three things don't apply, guess what? They're considered to be a copyright infringer, and they have to either stop what they're doing and maybe even pay some damages. So that gets us to the cases that are pending. You heard Dave mention that there's several different AI copyright infringement cases pending. We are up to about 30. Some of those cases has been consolidated. So if you count consolidated cases, you're probably about 24 cases at this point. 14 of those cases are class actions. Most of those cases involve authors or publishers suing LLM developers. But there are a few cases involving things like computer code and music and lyrics and photographs and things like that. Most of these cases have been brought in California or New York, and we don't have decisions in any of these yet. And it's going to be some time before we get to decisions on any of them. And the primary legal claim in these cases is the first one you see on the screen there, is that they're unauthorized copying or ingestion for training purposes. Okay, so in other words, in order to train the AI, they're taking a lot of stuff and they're making copies of it, and they don't have permission to do it. And that's a big, big issue. There are other issues that come up in these cases. We're not really going to talk about these that much, and that's infringement on the output stage. So if somebody puts in a prompt, and let's say you put in a prompt of, let's say, SpongeBob wearing a baseball hat and a tie, and you get SpongeBob wearing a baseball hat and a tie, which you will get 9 out of 10 times when you put that prompt in. Well, that's going to be, you've got an infringing work, and that's an infringing output. And so we're not going to talk too much about that, nor are we going to talk about the other claims that are raised, which is infringement of the copyright management information and removing that. And I really won't get into that. That gets fairly detailed. But if folks want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk about that later. So let's talk about the differences between the input and the output, just because I like to do this only because people tend to get confused about this. In the AI environment, there are two different potential infringements that take place. There's infringement that takes place in the ingestion, i.e. the training part of things, where works are being copied entirely to train the AI, right? And then there's the infringement on the output stage when a work is generated by the AI system. That's the SpongeBob example that I gave. And the legal analysis necessary to determine if infringement has taken place is very different, depending on whether you're talking about the input and the output. But like I said, we're going to talk about the input, the ingestion part of this going forward here, because that's really what all these cases hinge upon. So when you're determining whether there's an infringement has occurred during the ingestion process, the question of whether the ingested work, so let's say you have a podcast that it's ingested, is similar to the output, is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. What is relevant is what has been copied, because the right of reproduction is a standalone right, and it's implicated the moment an AI company makes a copy of the work during the ingestion process. And it's implicated regardless of whether that copying ultimately results in the AI system generating an output that is similar or identical to the copyrighted work. That's really important to know. I've kind of stressed this several times. So the first question you need to ask, if you're thinking about, wait a minute, maybe I should bring an infringement suit, somebody's stealing my stuff. The first question you need to go ask is a copy being made? Is the AI company copying your work and using it for training purposes? Okay, and that can be hard to tell because unfortunately there aren't very many, well, there are no transparency laws in this country. Hopefully we'll talk about a little bit of that later as well. That will change over time. But let's assume that the answer is yes, a copy is being made. Then you say, okay, well, wait a minute. Do they have a license to use that copy? If they do, then okay, you're done. There's no infringement. But if they don't, then you have to ask the last question, which is there a defense that applies specifically? Do they qualify for the fair use exception? Because that's the biggie. Okay. And in all these cases, these 30 some odd cases, they are all going to hinge on whether the use is considered to be a fair use. That's what all these cases have come down to. The facts are going to be different, but it's going to be a legal analysis of whether it's fair use. And we'll talk about what fair use is in a moment. But it's important to know that fair use is decided on a case by case analysis. So you may get the very first case to come down, maybe it's considered to be fair use, but then the next case isn't because the facts are different. And so the legal standard applies differently. And so of these 30 cases, just because one is or isn't a fair use doesn't mean the other 29 will be considered to be fair use. So that's important to understand. In my opinion, the biggest issues here are, is this what's called a transformative use? That falls under the first factor, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is what's the ultimate purpose of the use? Another thing is, what is the impact of scraping these pirate websites? In other words, even you can scrape legitimate websites, right, or get a license to that. But if you're still scraping pirate websites that have no authorization, Books3, I think, is not a website, but is a good example of that. Don't the AI companies have kind of unclean hands here? Aren't they? Fair use is an equitable doctrine, and they're going to have a tough time proving fair use if they're doing something that is somewhat illicit, if you will, like not. So, and then the last factor that should be considered is the fourth factor, which is what, if any, harm is there to the licensing markets, and we'll talk all about that. And let's see how much I still have, about 10 minutes here, so we'll talk about that. So let's go through the fair use analysis. I don't know how many folks are familiar with fair use, but this fair use is in essence made up of four factors. It's a defense to copyright. It is not a right in and of itself. And what fair use allows is a third party to use a copyrighted work without authorization from the copyright owner and without compensating the owner. So if these uses are held to be fair use, well, then there's going to be no licenses for them and they can just take whatever they want. But like I said, it's going to be on a case by case basis based on the fact of each case. Things that are typically fair use and are actually mentioned in the law itself are things like criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, research, scholarship, things like that are typically, not always, but typically fair use. Of the four factors you see up on your screen, none of them are dispositive. In other words, just because, oh, wait a minute, one of those is leaning toward fair use, then the whole thing must be fair use. It doesn't work that way. What you do is you take all four factors and you weigh them against one another. And so let me walk through these real quick without going into in depth. But the first factor has to do with the purpose and character of the use. And what will be looked at is the use commercial or non-commercial, right? And in most cases, AI use is going to be commercial, right? And we're talking about, by the way, generative AI here. I'm not talking about other types of AI, maybe to things like to cure cancer and things like that. We're talking about an AI system like Dave talked about, where you're putting information in, you're training the AI, and what comes out is an image, is a video, is text, things like that, right? And so transformative use, you might be like, well, what does that mean, transformative use? That is what all these cases are going to largely come down to, right? Is whether something is a fair use or not is largely going to depend on whether the use is transformative or not. So what a transformative use is the use that adds something new with further purpose or different character, and importantly, does not substitute for the original work. So if you could have licensed the work to the AI company, you could argue that that's a substitute for the work if somebody's just taking that instead. And then you look at, okay, so what is the purpose? What is the ultimate purpose of the AI? And think about that further. If let's say what's the purpose of a copyrighted song or a copyrighted work of art? You're likely thinking right now, maybe the purpose is to uplift, to provoke certain emotions, to inspire, to soothe, maybe just to entertain, or maybe even to educate. Now, take a step back and ask yourself, what is the purpose of AI-generated music or art, right? Is it any different than the purpose of the copyrighted song or the copyrighted music, or sorry, copyrighted work of art? And really, it's not. The purposes are identical. If you get a work of art that's generated by AI, how is the purpose of that art any different than the purpose of the art that was ingested? Similarly with the music, if you're creating AI music, isn't that music, the purpose of that music, the same purpose of the copyrighted music? And when the purposes are identical, then they're not going to be transformative, and therefore likely not a fair use. Now, the analysis is going to be different. We have a lot of podcasters on the line here, and podcasters is going to be different because, in a lot of times, the ingestion of a podcast is not going to result or generate a podcast. And so that's kind of an interesting analysis here. In terms of the nature of the use, nature of the copyrighted work, you look at, is the work a factual work or a nonfiction work? And in most cases, with AI's swallowing up whole or sort of nonfiction works, is fictional works. If Dave mentioned that there's more of a need for these nonfictional works and these STEM works and what have you. And so in that case, it's gonna, if it's a STEM work or a factual work, it might lean a little bit toward it being fair use, but in other cases, it's likely not going to. Factor 3 looks at the amount or substantiality of the portion that's used, and in most cases, this is going to weigh against the AI companies because what they're doing is taking everything. They're taking the entire thing, and so that's probably going to weigh against them. But factors 2 and 3 usually don't have that big of impact. It's usually factor 1 and the transformative use analysis, and then the biggie, the big kahuna, factor 4, right? That is the Supreme Court itself has said this is the most important factor. And what you look at for factor 4 is the effect of the use on the actual or potential market for or value of the work. And historically, like I said, this is the most important factor. And what you do here is you look at, is a licensing market being adversely impacted? Well, guess what? It probably is, right? There's a lot of licensing going on, not as much for individual creators, but certainly for companies and organizations that are licensing the works more and more these days to AI companies. And if all of a sudden the court were to say, okay, this is fair use, that licensing would stop, right? And that's a huge, huge harm to the market. And so factor 4, almost certainly you would think would weigh against an AI company. So you go through the 4 factors, and even though some of these factors may be closer than others, really it's somewhat unlikely that the AI companies are going to be able to prevail on their fair use claims. Okay, so
and just to offer, Keith, that there's no question that for my company, for Calliope Networks, our biggest competitor is free content.
Yeah. I mean, if you can get something for free, why license it, right?
Yeah.
So this is a fair use is the biggest issue, and within fair use, transformative and the harm to the market are the big areas of analysis. Do we know how these courts are going to come out? Not yet, because I mean we're still at least probably a year away from any court deciding a case of these 30 cases. There was one case that was supposed to go to court in August, and that got postponed. And then there's going to be appeals of these cases. So we're probably not going to we're going to get some idea from the courts, but we're probably not going to get really any kind of final determination, honestly, for years now. So, but let me talk very, very quickly about copyrightability, because that may be something you all are interested in. In case you're thinking about, okay, wait a minute, maybe I can use AI to improve my podcast or something. But wait a minute, my podcast is protected by copyright today. Will it continue to be protected by copyright? Well, that's a big question mark right now. I mean, there's certainly aspects of it will be depending on how you use AI, it may or may not be protected. The office, as the Copyright Office, was where decides what's protected by copyright and what's not, will refuse registration for AI generated works. Now, what does that mean? Well, if something is wholly created by AI, it's not going to be protectable, right? Although I imagine you all are thinking about using AI to some extent, but not completely, complete podcast. And so what you then need to do is, if you're registering your works with the Copyright Office, you need to disclose or disclaim the AI generated elements. However you use AI, you need to tell them how you used it, basically, and disclaim that. And some of this may change. I'm not going to go into detail how you do that or what that means, because the Copyright Office has said that they are going to change some of their guidelines at the end of the year because they've heard from people that the guidelines really don't work and there's some frustration with them. And so they realize it was a first step, and that so keep your eyes out by the end of the year for new guidance. And then the last thing I will talk about are sort of what's the government doing about AI. And Congress, is typical fashion, really isn't doing anything. There's a lot of hearings that they've held. There is pending legislation. So there's pending legislation on what's called digital replica, and that's the only bill that might pass at the end of the year. And what a digital replica bill is, it would protect things like voice, likeness, image, things like that. That's what's protected. And so if those of you who are podcasters, you're concerned about something ripping off your voice and all of a sudden hearing yourself, your own voice in something else, that's something you want to pay attention to. And then the other bill are transparency bills. And that's also something you want to pay attention to, because by imposing transparency on AI companies, they would have to disclose what they are copying. So you would be able to look and go, oh, let me see if they're copying my stuff. And if so, I want to get paid, right? I want to make sure that they pay me. Those transparency bills can go a long way to do that. You won't see those bills pass this year, but hopefully next year or the year after we'll get them passed. And then the president had issued an executive order on AI. So there's a whole bunch of activities in that regard. And then the Copyright Office, pursuant to that executive order, is working with the Patent and Trademark Office on investigating the impact of AI on copyright. And so they're producing 3, maybe 4 studies. The first study is already out on digital replicas. So if you're interested in that, go check that out at the Copyright Office website. That was published in July. They're expecting one on copyrightability that will be published in November, I'm hearing now. So that will be a big one that you might be interested in. And the last one, which might be split into 2 reports, we're expecting by the end of the year, but it might bleed over until next year, is on ingestion, fair use, and allocation of liability. And the last thing I will say is just to promote 2 things here. I encourage you to go to our website at copyrightalliance.org. You can see on this page here, we've got tons of educational material up on our site. Something specific to podcasters. So you might be interested in that. And also, if you're interested in joining the Copyright Alliance, it costs nothing. We send out a monthly newsletter with a whole bunch of information about kind of what's changing in copyright and especially AI. And then, although it's not listed here in Get Involved, we also have a free AI newsletter. So if you go to our website, go all the way to the right, go to the orange section, you can sign up for the newsletter as well and get AI information all the time. So with that, I am going to hand things back over to Dave. Let me stop sharing here. There we go. And Dave's going to go on and
yep, I'm going to pick my slides back up. Here, let's reshare. And if, by the way, so thanks for that, Keith. As we're talking about the copyrightability of purely AI generated works, it occurs to me that one of the things that is probably top of the agenda for the podcast community is Google's new product, Notebook LM. And if you all haven't seen that and played with it, you absolutely should, and you should do it today. What that does is you can take any document or website or anything, put it into Notebook LM, and it will create a podcast for you about it. And the podcast is, from what the handful of examples I've heard, it's a man and a woman, it's with humor, there's banter, it's kind of unbelievable. It's not maybe quite as good as the real thing, but boy, it's a scary approximation. So with that, I'm going to talk about, give a little commercial overview of kind of where we are and potentially where we're going. All right, so there is momentum in the market to licensing. Started, one of the big starting points, in the middle of the slide was this Google Reddit deal, where Google is paying Reddit $60 million per year for Reddit posts. And that came under a lot of criticism from so-called Redditors, from that user community. And for some good reason, but the good side of this equation is that instead of just deciding to scrape this and not tell anybody, Google's paying for the data. On the book side, there was a big deal earlier this year. John Wiley and Sons announced that they had earned $23 million on a book licensing deal for a number of reference books. And there's a lot of, I'm told from different copyright lawyers that there's a number of confidential bilateral deals out there between book publishers and AI companies, not disclosed. And I don't know, who or with whom they were licensed. On the news side, that's where OpenAI has been really active. OpenAI has done deals with, and this is just a subset of the deals, but on the slide, News Corp, Financial FT, Axios, The Atlantic, Le Monde, et cetera. So in those news deals, I mentioned retrieval augmented generation. That's what those are for. So I think they are less about a license for so-called training data and more about wanting, a model that was maybe built a year or two ago to have access to the latest news when people ask about it. So that's what that's about. And then just a note at the bottom, just to talk about how robust the potential licensing market is. Shutterstock publicly disclosed that they had earned more than $100 million via AI licensing. So there's real business opportunity there. But why do they license at all? Because they can, right now, most of these companies are taking a position that if content is quote unquote publicly available, that it is fair use. And we can debate that. I think Keith, I certainly dispute that. I suspect Keith disputes that. But that is the position they're taking, and they're doing it. They're scraping a lot of data. The headlines I shared earlier, from NVIDIA and Runway, were about spreadsheets that had been leaked from disgruntled employees showing just massive scraping activity. You can go look those spreadsheets up. I have, and they're massive. But yet these companies are licensing data, and they're doing it for a few reasons. One is licensed data tends to be a lot cleaner and more reliable. The second is, on the news side, the data is timely. It's updated. Third is they like hard to obtain data. So for Calliope Networks, for example, our catalog is built in part of films and television series that are global, that are from around the world. So we have, content from Ghana and Malaysia and India, and it would just be hard for an AI company to go find all of that. And it's not available online. It's not publicly available. And then the last one is, and this is important, there is a desire to avoid a litigation risk. But while Silicon Valley has this ethos of, let's go fast and break things, and they are very risk tolerant. They're not very risk averse. Their downstream customers are. So so OpenAI might have a huge tolerance for infringement risk, but if they're trying to do business with, Caterpillar or Ford Motor Company or something, those industrial giants may see things much differently. That's what we're told. There's a great quote on the advertising industry. This was out of a news organization called The Drum, with a quote from an executive at BBDO. And I'll just read it. While our teams have already been working with generative video tools from Runway and other companies, so Runway is a big scraping company, we've only been able to consider them for internal and R&D purposes due to the unlicensed content their models have been trained on, says James Young, head of creative innovation and ad agency BBDO. Firefly's video tool has the capacity to massively expand our sandbox. And just to explain that, Firefly is from Adobe, and Adobe is trying to quote unquote ethically source their training data. So Firefly is a model built on licensed content. So there you can see it from a third party that they worry about the downstream issues. So the podcast licensing opportunity, you all have access to some really interesting data. You have what I'm most interested in for Calliope is the video data. So a lot of podcasts are up on YouTube and otherwise available in a video format. You also have audio data. There are AI companies that are very interested in conversational data and in languages, et cetera. And then lastly is transcripts. So your podcast can be converted to transcripts and licensed to large language models for text. I think that's probably a declining license opportunity, but it's probably still existent to some degree. All right, so the current situation, I would argue, is the worst case scenario for copyright owners. And that is that for many of us, our content is being infringed today. and we're not being paid anything, and we've not negotiated any restrictions on use. So, so to the extent we worry that, gosh, I don't want to, give AI my content because it might disrupt my business. Well, your content is being given to AI, and to the extent it's going to disrupt your business, that's happening. But you're not getting any of the good things alongside with that. You're not getting paid, and you're not getting to negotiate certain license restrictions. So I put over on the right side of the slide, to license or not to license. AI is a threat to most businesses, I would say, and certainly creative businesses. And I think we shouldn't ignore that. But it is coming, and it is there's an inevitability to it, and whether you choose to license your content to it or not is really not going to have an appreciable impact on speeding it up or slowing it down. But AI creates an opportunity. And again, whether you license is mostly irrelevant to the level of the threat. So at Calliope Networks, we are advocates for engagement. We're advocates for licensing, and really putting the AI companies to the test that, to the extent they say licensing is difficult, we're trying to make it easy for them. So I think there's really three options for everybody, every content company. You can ignore this situation, you can litigate, and you can engage. And again, Calliope Networks is in the engagement business, where there's probably a place for an important place for litigation. We think ignoring things is not a great approach. I like this quote from Nicholas Thompson from The Atlantic after they entered into a deal with OpenAI. He said, "AI is coming. It is coming quickly. We want to be part of whatever transition happens. The transition might be bad or the transition might be good, but we believe the odds of it being good for journalism are higher if we participate." So I fully endorse that sentiment. So a little bit about Calliope Networks. We're a content aggregator, and we engage in direct and collective licensing for audiovisual content. So we are aggregating film and television, and news and sports, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, online content as well, like YouTube episodes. To date, we've aggregated a video library of over 30,000 hours of content. That's sourced from about 32 film, television, and news publishers, distributors, producers, et cetera, around the world. It's a global catalog. Our content comes from 6 continents. We have a lot of content from Latin America, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. We're really proud of that. And again, that's something that the AI companies value, because their data sets tend to be over-indexed to sort of American and European stuff. Things that we're not, which I put on the slide in bold, we're not a marketplace, and we're not solving the so-called attribution problem. So there are companies out there that are marketplaces where you can just list your content for sale, and maybe somebody will buy it, maybe somebody won't. We don't think that's the best model for maximizing value for content owners. Again, I worked at places like Universal and 20th Century Fox and Paramount, and I never would have. And I was approached many times to do things like put Transformers and Mission Impossible and The Godfather up on a marketplace, and we never did that, based on the theory that we thought we could maximize value better by doing direct licensing. So that's what we do. We are essentially advocates for content owners to maximize value. Yesterday, we had an important announcement. We announced, this is the last bullet on the slide, we announced our license to Scrape. And this covers publicly available online video and is focused on YouTube content. So what this is we are, as I mentioned earlier, the AI companies, many of them, not all of them, but many of them have taken the position that if something is available online, and if it's available on YouTube, they have the right, they have essentially fair use to go scrape that content and use it for free without a license and without telling anybody. We disagree with that view, and what we're looking to do is to pull together hopefully millions of hours of YouTube content, and then in time, as number one, as some of the more ethically inclined AI companies want to license the content, and second, as maybe some court cases start to go the way that Keith's suggesting they will go, we'll be a company that has a large corpus of video content that is scrapable. Much of it might have already have been scraped, and this will clean up licensing for those AI companies. So we think that's an exciting opportunity. And again, I think that's a place where members of the Podcast Academy could potentially participate directly with Calliope Networks. This was all announced yesterday, the license to scrape. So you're the second audience for this. And we had a really nice article in Wired magazine yesterday about it. I would encourage you to read it. And that is it. So, and just a quick shout out for Calliope Networks. Our website is calliopenetworks.ai. You have my email and phone number there, and we're available for, send me an email or give me a phone call or shoot me a text if you're interested in learning more about licensing content, and if you're interested in consulting, because we can help, just to help formulate AI strategies generally. And that is it. So I think Nancy suggested we might get questions.
So thank you both so much for that. That was very informative. Lots of information that is completely new to me. It looks like we do not have any questions in the Q&A box. We do have about 10 minutes.
We won't take it personally.
It looks like we have about 10 minutes left. I would say before we close, if there's one thing that you want them to walk away with from today's webinar, what would it be for both of you?
So to Keith's point that licensing solves everything, I think that's really important. I on a different webinar last week, the Copyright Clearance Center did a webinar, and they suggested that they pointed out that there's 193 different copyright regimes around the world, and everyone's got their different version of fair use or text and data mining or whatever the exceptions are. But the idea that an AI company could weave their way through exceptions for 193 different copyright jurisdictions, plus, by the way, state laws are different in the United States, seems really hard, and licensing sort of solves all of the problems. We're big advocates for licensing as a solution, and so I'd encourage members of the Podcast Academy to to be a part of that solution.
Yeah, my big takeaway is similar to Dave's. I mean, Dave had this image of this person with their head in the sand or in the ground or whatever, and you just can't be that. You just no creator, no copyright owner can be that way these days, especially when it comes to AI. There are licensing opportunities here. As a podcaster, you should be looking for all the different ways that you can sort of make money off of your talent and your creativity. And to just ignore AI licensing as a possibility, it just doesn't make any sense. And so to Dave's point, you ought to be looking at, okay, how can I go about licensing this? And if you're an independent creator, certainly that might be difficult. But there are, like Calliope, licensing regimes, licensing manager or collective rights management organizations that can represent groups of people and negotiate licenses with the AI companies. You ought to be looking into that. The time to be sticking your head in the sand is probably at least 9 months, if not much longer, over. I think this is something you really ought to be thinking about and looking into immediately.
Well, we thank you both for your time, and we look forward to continue to learning more about AI.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.